Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this BCI sponsored event titled How to Automate IT Disaster Recovery Plans with Runbooks. So in this webinar today, it's hosted by Cutover. We're going to talk about how your IT disaster recovery, whether it's on premise or in the cloud, is just really becoming increasingly complex, but also very essential. And so here we want to give you a lot of information on how you can leverage things like automated runbooks to create a better way to streamline the recovery process, be able to reduce human error, really mitigate risk. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking a lot about some of the emerging disaster recovery challenges that you would have within your tech stack, some of the benefits of using automated runbooks as opposed to static plans, whether in Excel or in a Word document. So we're going to help you look at what those best practices are, some of the frameworks across your technology recovery stack, and really how you can get better information, real-time visibility, and also regulatory audit proof and compliance within your recovery plans, which is becoming increasingly important. And then we'll also talk about, just some of the other areas on how you keep all the stakeholders involved and the integrations that you can do across the tech stack. So in this webinar, we have, we have our Chief Product Officer, Marcus Weldsmith. He's going to be going through a heavy load of the content today in combination with Karen Guttridge, our CTO officer here at Cutover. I am Walter Kenrick. I'm Vice President of Product Marketing. And so why don't we go ahead and take it away? So Marcus, why don't you kick us off here?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, the first bit when we look at this is really trying to understand kind of why this is a challenge, and and also why it's a worthy challenge to go after. And I think what we see today is just a huge amount of architectural complexity in terms of the amount of choice that organizations have in terms of choosing what technology that they want to run to support their business, and the fact that actually there is no one right answer. And so when you look at the complete stack, there is so much choice with kind of on-premise and clouds and different ways to operate that actually kind of you end up with a kind of very mix around how you approach this. And I think, Kieran, we've talked quite a lot about why this is important and why it drives us to have kind of fairly complex discussions with our customers around the approaches that they're taking. And maybe you could kind of add a bit of flavor to this in terms of what we see as the challenge people are dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest piece, if we look at the bottom, where you have to manage everything, and I think it's the sort of pets versus cattle argument, in that when you're down at the compute, storage and network layer, if it's on-prem, you've got people that know where the servers are, know where the cables are, let alone the software that's running on top of this. When you look at the other end of this and you look at a full SaaS service, you actually could be completely blind as to how it's even being run, and you are literally just consuming it as a service. Each has its own benefits and downsides with regards to disaster recovery. If you're naive with the SaaS solution, it might be that your vendor isn't offering any sort of recovery between regions. If their cloud provider was to go down in one region or even one zone, you might have a problem. Whereas if you understand where your compute and storage is, then you would know if it's only in one data center or whether it's spread across multiple sites. And so the gamut in the middle just means that there's a lot of complexity, mainly because you're probably going to have some applications and some services that you're consuming as a SaaS. And certainly the majority of our customers definitely have some on-prem applications that will never be moved for data residency, latency, and all sorts of other requirements. So these applications will stay on-prem.
Yeah, and I think, we kind of obviously sit in a position as a SaaS provider ourselves. We kind of host cut over on AWS, and what we've seen over the last couple of years is a massive increase in the interest in how we're resilient and what our processes are. So, no longer are we seen as a black box, and I think that's the same for any other provider. Organizations are really caring now about kind of their SaaS solutions and how they are being resilient. So even though those organizations have no particular control over that resiliency, they still want to understand what the process is. And so kind of really this leads to quite a lot of complexity. And Walter, if you kind of jump on to the next slide. Oh,
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Technical. There we go.
Yeah, I think what we see is that organizations end up with a mixed technology estate. This isn't kind of a view of kind of moving from one to another. It is the fact that actually it's very justified that organizations choose different solutions and different architectures for different types of application, partly because you're choosing the right solution to solve the right business problem, but also around how you optimize for cost as well. And so what you end up with is, a set of services or applications, depending on terminology, that actually sit in a number of these different boxes. And I think very few organizations would say that they sit in one. And this is also used to think about how organizations transform their technology estate. And Kieran, I think you'll often get involved in that sort of how do you modernize, and maybe there's definitely a path within this, isn't there, in terms of how applications or services may move through these different options.
Yeah, I suppose if we just take the moving an application that we've decided we could move to the cloud, and you think that that's a way of getting easier disaster recovery because you've got software-defined infrastructure, you can achieve that. Either you've just lifted and shifted and you continue to use sort of the second pillar in here, which is you're in the cloud, so you're no longer on premise, and you're using some sort of infrastructure as code, so CloudFormations, the Terraforms of the world, to produce, if you were moving to AWS, AMIs that are baked and you could deploy into any region. Versus what we see quite a few of our customers doing is containerizing the applications on-prem. So we move right over to that right-hand stack and run their container runner. And then eventually they just move the container runner to the cloud and they run on one of the managed services for running the clusters. And that can lead to a lot of difference in that, is somebody now running the platform? So if somebody is running that container service, either it's yourselves running it, or if you've got it as a managed service, you still need to understand that and who is going to agree to do that piece on top of when your application is sitting on this. So versus where if you're in that middle container where maybe you've adopted a lot of serverless technology, maybe it is very much that the development team or the service team, depending on how you're configured, is actually adopting the you ship it, you own it, you fix it sort of approach. So you've got a gamut across here, and knowing who and when and how to call people in the event of a disaster becomes difficult based off what are quite sane choices even at this level. But in the event of disaster, you need to know how and where an application is running.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that then leads on to kind of the stance that we take in terms of, well, what are the challenges that gives? And I think the couple of pieces before really around that kind of architectural complexity that's driving. And I think that pushes a bunch of other stuff. So, you you need kind of a different set of skills for those different types of architecture. So you're adding complexity, but also adding team complexity in terms of kind of who's available to manage and improve each of those environments. The fact that you potentially are then kind of looking at ITDR testing in kind of slightly siloed or isolated ways, because it needs to be different for the different types of architecture. And I know, Kieran, any particular ones that you'd pull out from here as well?
Yeah, I think my particular favorite, particularly where Runbooks can help, is that consistent health checking and automation, because they're quite often linked. If a service is scaling, you might have started off early on when something's a pet, that you've got daily health checks, and this can be quite a manual process. And as you scale, you probably find that the time you've got available to do that manual health check for each pet goes down, and that isn't ideal. So you start to think automation. I think when we talk to our customers, everybody wants to automate more, either because it's no longer possible to do consistently manually, so they want to reduce risk, or they just want to reduce cost and reassign those people to something more beneficial than sort of doing daily health checks. But it can very quickly become a full-time project, and it can be hard to get going. So I think one of the things we have seen with our customers is where they've gone from daily health checks that were done manually to using tools like Genios and Ansible to actually do health checks. And then the team that was doing those can spend the time either writing more automations or really digging into the false positives that those tools might supply. And having the structure on what to do for your automation. One of the things I'm a big believer in, if you're fully manual today, is sort of the do nothing scripting, which just lists the steps that you are doing, and breaking tasks down into smaller tasks wherever possible, so that the skilled resources can get going on the easiest piece and identify the piece in the chain that will be the best, will get us the most bang for our buck for automation, either because we're always blocking and waiting for that to happen. And when we have done the automation, it could be that if we can throw more compute at a problem so that you can run more workers, we can parallelize more and more of this automation. And I suppose just that piece of getting going is always the hardest part that we see within our customers.
And I'm always very conscious that we don't want to just take our observations from the people that we're working with day to day. And I think that kind of gets us onto a survey that we recently ran to really inform, is the section of what we're looking at with our customers kind of representative of what's out there more widely. And kind of, Walter, if you could introduce that a little bit more, that would be great.
So what we did was we went off to 300 people across a number of different verticals in the US as well as in EMEA predominantly, and really looked at from the CIO down to people that are managing the applications network. We went off and surveyed them to find out a number of different areas, whether it was on automation, investment risk, cybersecurity. So we pulled out some of the stats that we thought were pretty relevant, at least at this point, for sharing with the BCI constituency. So in relation to what we've talked about earlier, we're talking about, okay, some risks and challenges with the organization, especially with the outdated disaster recovery procedures. So here we went off and surveyed just recently. The report hasn't even been fully fleshed out yet, so you guys are getting the early view of this. But we asked, what are the 3 biggest risks to your organization from an outdated disaster recovery procedure? And so, Kieran and Marcus, we clearly saw that the cyber attacks, the increased vulnerability, I don't think that's a huge surprise as you see things like ransomware, DDoS attacks coming up. So you need to be able to recover that. There's a lot of regulatory. But one area that I did kind of find pretty interesting was at 50%, everybody chimed in that the intensifying problems due to continued failures. I thought that was kind of eye-opening, that these organizations haven't really built resilient architectures, and so they do need to spend more time looking at the recovery perspective. But anything stand out to you, or any comments that you guys would see here?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. Cyber. I mean, I think the fact that those processes tend to be complex, not automated, and the need to go through kind of a step of isolation and understanding kind of what the attack was, and having a solid response to that, being something that is very hard to automate, because you don't know what it was to start with. I think it's definitely something that we're having a kind of very large number of conversations about, in terms of what does that mean when you try and kind of apply runbooks and automation to that process. That definitely resonates. So I'm not surprised at all that's come out top. Kieran, any from you?
I think the first two are almost inextricably linked, in that as you adopt software, you tend to adopt even more software. So therefore, you just could not even the outdated disaster recovery plan, but as you've adopted more software, you probably just need more disaster recovery plans. And with shared services, and I think it links to the continued failures, is if you've adopted things, CVEs are getting more and more prominent. There seems to be more and more every day. So your patching cycle becomes continual. If we look at recent, at bugs in, or CVEs in OpenSSL and similar, Log4j, they're common libraries that are used across many applications, and therefore you really need to get sight of which applications are affected, which could potentially therefore fail. How can you ring fence them? How can we recover them? Quite often the means of recovering them with microservices is restarting them and redeploying them in a sort of canary way. And these things are all difficult. They need organizational change, and they need a lot of coordination, because if it is a shared service, you need to notify multiple stakeholders that you're going to do this, and coordinating those.
Great, thanks. So we also took a look at some of the key barriers towards automating the disaster recovery in these organizations. And here again, we gave them an option of multiple choice in terms of what those barriers or objections were towards the automation, moving away from static type of environments. And what we found, and Marcus and Karen, I'll ask you guys to comment again, but kind of stood out. People don't really know where to focus their efforts. Which services do they prioritize? And then do they even have the skills needed to automate some of those components? Those clearly came out at the top of that. So and I'll ask you guys to maybe chime in, give a little commentary there.
Yeah, I think number one is my favorite. It again links to two, but I think it's the technology and the technologist in the room. There's a temptation, particularly within your development team, to go and cut new code and solve a problem. It's what developers are trained to do all around the world, and knowing where best to focus them. They might focus on something that recency bias is a real problem here. The thing that caused them the most pain recently might not actually be the best bang for the buck, because it might be something that only happens annually. Whereas if they were to automate something that goes away daily, they'd probably have more time. So I think knowing and having data rather than gut feel as to where to provide, or what is going to be the weakest link in a whole change across your disaster recovery processes is important, because otherwise you might optimize something that individually looks great because you've taken something that took 10 minutes down to 1 minute and you think that's brilliant. But if there's a process in that recovery procedure that is either waiting around for 3 hours for somebody to pick up, or takes, hours to actually achieve, probably better trying to break that task up and automating there. So having the data available to you rather than relying on opinion is really useful.
Yeah, and I definitely would pick up on the finding suitable vendors. So we would typically look at how we integrate with automation tools, and we see quite a mix. We also see quite a lot of change in terms of organizations deploying a solution and then finding it doesn't scale in the way they wanted or doesn't solve quite the problem. And so I think when it comes to the topic that we're talking about around automation runbooks, I think having the flexibility to kind of jump into different vendors and not be tied to anything in particular is really important here, because as we kind of touched on right at the beginning, different types of automation and different vendors work well or not well with different types of architecture. And so, it's not necessarily kind of picking one solution, it's the right solution for the right problem, and the need to be able to kind of tie kind of any automation around the end-to-end runbook of recovering into those tools, whatever they may be. So I think, yeah, interesting data, and it's kind of always good to look a little bit wider rather than just the set of customers that we deal with day in, day out. So kind of really useful for everyone who responded to this.
Yeah, I also think they're tied together, but the buy-in from the leadership and the budgetary constraints were kind of surprising that those were picked. At least over a third of the survey respondents selected that. I would see that they'd want to try to cut costs, certainly using automation so they don't affect any type of reputation, financial loss that they would have. I would probably have expected that not to be a constraint or barrier, but obviously it is, and based on the survey, which is to me somewhat surprising, because automation reduces costs theoretically and get rid of all of those manual tasks. So kind of interesting data, as you said, but let's move ahead as we move forward. So Marcus, we're going to start talking about more around the Runbook automation.
Yeah, thanks, Walter. So far we've probably been really just setting the scene around kind of why it's needed and why it's hard, and a lot of that is around the kind of underlying complexity in architecture. And what we see is that organizations are really striving to architect resilient applications that will update seamlessly, recover automatically, and there's a huge amount of tooling available that can be leveraged around infrastructure as code, automation, monitoring tools, kind of CI/CD tooling that enables you to take pretty large swathes of complex process and manual effort and get those into code. And we think that's the right target, but we kind of are very conscious that there do remain process gaps that need to be bridged, right? And that's what this diagram really is showing, is that there are fantastic solutions, but there are scenarios, such as cyber recovery and kind of, unforeseen outages that are of a cause that wasn't anticipated, that don't automate fully. And kind of those really do drive the need for a more complex process, a slightly higher level process that isn't necessarily 100% baked in. You don't quite know what it's going to be. And also some applications that are being run just don't warrant the investment to get to a high level of automation. Maybe they're, whether they're legacy or the way that they operate, just, you don't want to invest it. So you end up with kind of a set of things that you still need essentially to have automated run books that bind this stuff together. And what we're finding is those enable technology teams to codify the more high risk, more complex, and often fragile processes that that you need to manage the technology estate, such as recovering for an event that causes outage. How do you patch rapidly for an unforeseen vulnerability? Things like, what's the process for how do you migrate between those architectures, particularly migrating to the cloud? And so partly you've got these processes that are a little bit kind of unexpected and need some flexibility. But also what we see is those processes don't necessarily run to plan. It's not a case of pressing a button and it just happens seamlessly. There are unknown and unexpected things. And so you need, when you look at a run book that kind of joins this stuff together, you need essentially a flexible glue that joins those process steps with the people and the automations that you need, so that you can execute these things under pressure, but also adapt them quickly. And that's kind of what we're seeing is the focus around, and why we're running this session, and kind of what we really spend our time on is what is an automated run book and how does it solve those problems?
Oh, why don't we get right into that?
Yeah, I think what we really see here is that you want a set of tasks that you believe is the best path to recover, that codifies, the steps that need to be taken, both with your teams, kind of the underlying kind of technology that you have and the automations, but it needs to be flexible, that you could edit it on the fly, you could skip a bit, you could add something new, and do that in a way that's visible and auditable, and essentially quick to respond. And so that's kind of our view of what an automated runbook is. It kind of provides that flexible glue.
I think, as you're saying, Marcus, it really is that piece around being flexible in the moment. So whilst you're going to have great processes, great automations, in the event of disaster, something will be slightly out of kilter and you're going to need to adjust either before you start your recovery, or you're identifying what the cause is, or in the middle of your recovery when something else becomes more apparent. And so whilst the bulk of the work is sort of jumping between decision points, it's at those decision points, how do you have enough flexibility that a team in a high stress situation has the guidelines and runners to really help them, but at the same time are not hampered by the sort of perfect pipeline that might be incredibly brittle, and only able to respond to predefined inputs.
Yeah, and then I think when we look at integrations, it's very common to see a whole suite of tools that can be integrated to. And I think what we generally find is there's a level of complexity beyond that. We typically engage with large enterprise businesses, and we rarely find that the tool that's kind of, you can go to the website and look at it and read the APIs, is actually what you have to integrate to for security and scalability reasons. There's often a layer in between. And so the flexibility of being able to integrate to something that's, probably not a native tool, but has got some abstraction above it is really key in terms of how you build those automation runbooks and the links from them to the underlying tools and technology. And, Kieran, kind of with your kind of CTO hat, this is pretty common for you, right? In terms of the way that you engage with customers to solve the integration problems that they have.
Yeah, and I think most of it comes down to auth within their systems, and that is both authentication and authorization. Some of these services might operate functionally, so they don't need an end user. whereas more and more we are seeing, for auditability reasons and just best practice in least privilege, they are operating as a user, and we need to check at the moment they're about to execute that the person that's executing is authorized to do this. And as you say, that leads to quite often there being a layer that engineering might be aware of, but the non-engineers are perhaps not aware that there is this facade or sort of firewall or some other restriction in front of the service. They just want the service to run. And allowing both the sort of engineering teams to show that there is a tax up front and pay that tax up front via a runbook lets them do it outside of the event of a disaster. It's a lot easier to sort of do it then in a zero stress situation than in the moment when it's a high stress situation. And the same with non-eng needing to engage and explain to engineering why this service needs to meet this RTO. And that can be more apparent when you've got the whole steps listed and you've got visibility, you've got data as to why you're going to need to eke out 5 or 6 minutes here and there, which if you just look at it in isolation might not be apparent and look like it's just work for work's sake.
Yeah, and I think then, I think it's easy to understand the challenges and kind of the runbooks and the integration of those runbooks to make them automated kind of addresses those challenges. But I think you only really do that if there's a clear motive and a clear benefit. And we really boil this down to these 4 key areas. So, one is around how do you have the kind of the precision orchestration that even though the steps that you need to take can't necessarily be 100% baked in at the beginning, and you may need to adapt them, that you still need a level of precision in how do you orchestrate who does what when, or what order it gets done in, or what integration you need to kick off to drive an automation at any point in time. So that precision is absolutely key, and we see is kind of a big outcome that we get. I think risk and risk reduction is a second area. So if you're relying on more manual ways to orchestrate kind of that process, then you're much more reliant on individuals as single points of failure or the point of knowledge, rather than having that knowledge codified in a repeatable way. And so I think lowering risk and particularly the reducing the risk of making a mistake through manual error is a big part of this, that you remove the cognitive load off individuals and kind of have the best possible path that you know of already ready. And so people can focus on the tough problems around like what the root cause is and what are we going to do next, and how do we need to adapt, rather than the baseline plan of what you think you should do and how to automate it. So I think those top 2 are big benefits. And then Kieran, I'll let you talk a bit around integration and automation, but at the high level for me, it's very much organizations have invested a lot already in automation, but it's sometimes buried. And so a big part of this for me is just how do you surface that and make it usable.
Yeah, I think that one for me, we quite often see if we take a service like Ansible that's been adopted widely, the theory would suggest that if we have 1,000 apps and let's say 300 of them are using a database, we should see a reasonable amount of consolidation. So you'd expect to see less Ansible playbooks than you have apps because they're operating as a shared service. The practice, unfortunately, differs from the theory, and we tend to see far more, by an order of magnitude, Ansible playbooks for the amount of applications that are running. And that's usually just because in a large org, you've got to syndicate that way of working and make it easily consumable both to eng and non-eng. And I think the advantage of having a runbook for that is you can look at how other similar services, just by filtering the runbooks and thinking, okay, I'm running a service in an Azure cloud. How have they hooked up to Azure DevOps, or how are they using serverless functions and similar, and find out where there are pockets of automation, either for standing up, monitoring, or recovering a service. And by doing that, you'll make the team's life easier. I think one of the nice things we heard from our customer is that by leveraging some of the automations that were there, they can give some of the team their weekends back, which has always got to be a benefit.
Yeah, thanks for that. I completely agree. And then the final bit there is just around kind of dashboards and audit, having the visibility that you don't need to devote a lot of time to, asking, are we nearly there yet? And interrupting the teams that are doing the work. You really want that visibility to just be seamless and non-interruptive. And also reduce the amount of work after an event around the audit and visibility. So, trawling instant messaging and emails and pulling all that data together to try and create the narrative after the event of what happened and what did we do, which is, needed for continuous improvement, but also for internal audit. And sometimes the regulator is a really big part of this, that if you have those steps codified and you have a way of capturing what happened when in a dynamic way, you massively reduce the burden of overhead around how do you give visibility to whoever needs it, either during the recovery or post the recovery. So kind of that's our view of the benefits. And I think the final bit really is just kind of, I suppose, just relaying this back to kind of our view of the world in terms of what cutover is and what cutover does. So we are very much focused on being kind of providing automated runbooks for technology teams. We see that as being a base layer of capability, kind of shown here in the blue, that has got the various things that are needed around kind of API and integrations to feed out to other systems. The fact that you need a set of templates of what's on the shelf in terms of how do you respond to a particular situation. The ability to automatically execute, so potentially taking a trigger from a monitoring system and automatically substantiating and initiating one of those runbooks to respond to that event, and inviting and involving the people that need to be part of it. And we just covered kind of live visibility and reporting, an audit trail, and that kind of post-execution analysis. So we see those as being the core kernels of what kind of we do as an automated runbook platform. But we then kind of see that fanning out pretty quickly in terms of where can that be applied. And we were talking kind of very much here about around recovery, which is kind of the top section, and that has a range of different flavors to it in terms of cyber disaster recovery. Kieran touched quite a lot on health checks, but also how do you look at recovery in cloud when you're kind of failing over between regions, for example. But I think migration and release are incredibly close kind of relations to recovery, in terms of, if you're releasing well with confidence, then you're far less likely to cause an incident in the first place and need to recover. So that kind of spans upgrades, patching, kind of platform implementation changes. And then the other side is really just the ongoing evolution of the technology estate through migration. So how are you moving those services, applications between the different methods that you have available to you? And this is ongoing kind of all the time through the kind of the change initiatives that organizations have. And so we whilst kind of we're focusing here very much on recovery, see automated Runbooks support kind of all three of these, and that's very much our focus. Yeah, and then kind of how does that actually translate to benefits? We've kind of worked quite a lot in terms of numerical studies that we've done and have proven this in a number of kind of US kind of banking customers and wider financial institutions around, significant 50% level reductions in the recovery time to execute, massive reduction in how much time you need for reporting. So kind of don't involve people after the event with lots of kind of analysis, but have that to hand automatically straight away. And also kind of the time to exercise. So, you obviously, when anybody runs a recovery exercise, you want to plan it in a way that you know that it's going to not interrupt normal business. And actually that planning often takes a huge amount of time and preparation to get it just right. By having that codified in Runbooks can massively reduce that. And we've seen, that almost go from one extreme from 12 weeks down to 2 weeks in terms of planning a major event like a data center failover. And so that's kind of what we're striving for in terms of making sure that we're not just solving the problems, but that those deliver real benefits to the organization.
Great. Well, thank you, Marcus and Kieran. So before we take some questions, we have a few in the Q&A box, where the BCI constituency can find out more about Cutover. You can go out to cutover.com. We have a full resource library out there. Lots of examples of what Marcus and Kieran were talking about today in terms of how we can help with automated runbooks. Certainly some of the integrations, more detail on that. We have a full developer API as well that you can go and peruse. And then there's a ROI report as well as a calculator that you can go off and see some of the value that you would get. So you can really help to understand where you can leverage the Cutover automated runbooks to really standardize and automate the processes that Marcus and Karen were talking about today, but more effectively to increase that efficiency and very importantly, reduce the risk by bridging that gap or that glue between your teams and technology with these automated runbooks. So with that, let me flip over to the Q&A. I know we have a couple there, so just bear with me for a second. Okay, so one of the questions that we had, Marcus, Karen, I think both of you can kind of chime in here. So how do our Cutover customers, do they manage runbooks from getting out of date? They're all over the place. It's easy for these things to get out of date. So what should they do in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, typically what we find is there's an expected review cycle, and that's something that's kind of set in as a kind of an SLA, and that we find that generally changes depending on the priority of the tier of the service, and so but it often would be an annual process of attestation, and we've essentially built that into the Cutover platform, that any time a response is templated for an application or service, that there can be a kind of review cycle associated with that gets automatically triggered with the expectation that gets signed off. And we see kind of that as very much not being a read a document and click a button, but we give visibility of has that template actually been executed, and therefore have you got good reason to have confidence that that's been executed and it performed as expected last time and it was adjusted accordingly. So that was a reasonably early request from customers and something we brought in a year or so ago.
Yeah, great, thanks. Maybe Karen, maybe you can take this one. So question came in, I'll kind of paraphrase a little bit, but do you see customers failing over from their on-premises, their data centers to a cloud provider? And one of the essence of the questions that I'm taking out is, how can an automated runbook help in that failover model?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's sort of one of the advantages of the cloud, in that public clouds tend to be elastic. You're only paying for what you use. So they can be a great way of having that thing that can be there in the event of a black swan event. So various services out there that can help you do this as well. So the likes of Zerto, Cloud Endure, Amazon disaster recovery services, and there's a multitude of others that can give you that sort of bit level replication of your on-prem data center, so that you have got something off-site and distributed away from your normal pieces that can be hydrated in the event of a disaster. And having an automated runbook to trigger that, it is the sort of thing you can pre-can, so that you are getting visibility that you're going to fail over to effectively another data center, to a software application. It hopefully doesn't matter too much depending on how you're architected. And then importantly, how do you fail back? So that's the really important one that might get forgotten about otherwise, is that fail back approach, and remembering to shut all the resources off. And that's true in a migration as well. It's not only the getting there and recovering and then everybody breathing out, it's actually to, in the case of a migration, to realize some of the cost benefits, is making sure you really are cleaning up behind yourself and decommissioning services that might otherwise be running.
Great. Thanks for that. Just one last question that kind of just recently came in. They keep all their recovery plans in a spreadsheet. How could they migrate those, into a tool such as Cutover? How could they migrate those recovery plans that they have? Is there an easy way?
Yeah, I mean, so we have a sort of CSV import, so we tend to find that when we start with a new customer, you kind of go through a process over a period of time of migrating those, and it's usually quite event driven in terms of doing it for a purpose, and therefore you can migrate and then test straight away to validate that they're accurate. But yeah, we have a mechanism for that via taking something in Excel, putting it in CSV, and then uploading it to Cutover.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that looks to be the end of the questions. I want to thank everybody for attending today. And Marcus and Karen, thank you very much. I think, presented really great outline on the value of automating your runbooks, automating the technology into the tech stack. And with that, we'll close out for today. Again, thank you everybody for attending. Bye.
Bye.